So, we are all here because we care to solve a problem, right? We identify something that's a pain point for us. We want to solve it. We want to create impact. We want to change people's lives and build a product that really matters. Everyone at least starts with that ambition. And I hope it's not, if you don't start with that ambition and the ambition is, I want a $10 million exit in 6 months, I want to flip a company, it's probably not the right thing to do. There are many other ways to do that. Building a product is really, really hard. So unless you care about creating impact and solving a problem, this is not where you should focus your time on. So let's just walk through what that journey looks like. It's day one, you launch a product, you start with 0 users, right? Some find you, some of them you bring along, either through marketing, through advertising, through word of mouth. So you have some users, you start to see some usage patterns, right, in how people are using your product. These are your early adopters, right? Sometimes they're very well aligned with what you had originally thought the product flow would look like, how people would use your product. Sometimes it's not. And if it's not, it doesn't mean it's the end of the road. Actually, most of the successful companies are built where they started with a different problem statement, but they end up solving a different problem. I'll give you one example. I don't know if you guys know about this, but Instagram did not start as Instagram. Instagram started as an app called Bourbon. What Bourbon did was, it was actually some version of Foursquare where it let you sort of share things with your friends, check into places, things like that. And then upload some photos and all of that. And within the first 3 months, the 2 founders noticed that people weren't really doing anything on the app other than sharing photos. But there were lots of different platforms that helped you share photos. There was Facebook back then, there was, there was Twitter, there was a bunch of photo sharing apps. There was Flickr, for people who remember what Flickr was. So they tried to understand what about this platform made it unique for them to share photos on this platform. And it was fairly clear that was basically the social network they had on the platform. What they felt was it was fairly private for them to share the moments that they would not get judged on, things like, hey, I'm eating this food. Hey, I am walking through this street and I see this pretty tree. And so one of the founders, Kevin, had this idea on people want to share their day-to-day stuff that they get excited about, that makes their life look more pretty than it is in reality, and how can we help them make that, help them do that more effectively and more easily. Even the most naive user, not a professional photographer, should be able to share photos that look professional. And so he said, why don't we just build filters and build this flow, and that'll be a USP. And so they actually pivoted from Bourbon to Instagram, which just became the photo sharing app. And today it has 700 million MAUs. The point I'm trying to make is that you may start with an idea that on what your users want the product to solve, but it may not be that. And don't be disappointed. Listen to what the users are trying to tell you in terms of the usage pattern. And if you see that consistently happening in your early adopters, there's definitely a need there. And so, let's say, some of your early adopters get really excited about the product. They start spreading the word. They share it with their friends. They all, early adopters have this urge to be the trendsetters. They always want to be the first one to talk about it. So they'll go and tell their friends at dinner parties. Like, oh, look at this new app I have. Have you tried that out? And then, word of mouth kicks in, some more users join us. At that point, you start looking at data because you have enough to look at, enough and more to look at. You start tracking some metrics. You'll talk about, most companies will start over-tracking at this point. They'll start tracking things like, we have X number of installs, we have monthly uniques, we have DAU-MAU ratios looking healthy, retention rate on D7, on D30. It gets fairly complex fairly quickly. So you're completely overwhelmed, you're confused, you don't know what you should do now. How do you go from here to building a $10 million business to a $100 million business, right? And so I think this is a pattern you'll see at one startup after another, right? And the only thing that actually is the key difference between startups that actually end up becoming successful and the ones that don't is when you start to really focus on this key question of, are people really using your product? All the metrics you track, they're great. You should track them. I'm all for being data-driven. But sometimes over-tracking and just being obsessive about vanity metrics, as they say it, is not always a good idea because it actually confuses you sometimes. And it's important very early on when you're still trying to find the product market fit to understand, simplify the questions you're trying to ask so you really know if you've answered those questions. One of the biggest questions that a lot of people talk about, but it's really hard to implement in reality is, are people actually using your product? And how do you define that, right? So you're going to ask me, how do I tell if they are? And I think it's these three things. One is you need to identify what the motivation of using that product is. Why is your product used? What is the use case? What is the core action? What behavior is being used over and over again in your product? You may have 4 features, but there's probably one that's most commonly used. That is the core action that's bringing the user back to the product. And what is the frequency of use? I think this is one of the most important things to understand. And yes, it's great to say that everything, I want a DAU, which is 80%. But it doesn't have to be that. It depends on what the product is. And the best way to understand what the frequency of use should be is to actually look at the natural user behavior and patterns, right? So if you're building a tax software, you're probably only going to use that software once a year. Nobody files for taxes more than that, right? Every March end, you file for a tax. So if you expect that product to have a DAU of 50%, it's never going to happen. Nobody's going to come back every day and check your product. But on the other hand, if you are a messaging app, people message on a daily basis as just natural behavior pattern. And so you should have a DAU, which is around 50, 60%. So even understanding what the frequency number should be is highly dependent on understanding what the natural behavior pattern of your product is. And so, I think you can look at benchmarks against your natural behavior patterns. You can also look at industry standards. There are a bunch of these analytic companies that actually lay out these standards. That's fairly good to look at and benchmark against. So you can see here how communication is, high frequency, as well as retention over 90 days should be fairly high, because it's a use case that people use fairly often on a day-to-day basis. But if you look at something like, tax software, streaming music, social games, they have a higher frequency, but the retention is lower because those are platforms where people look for new music, they look for new games. You kind of tap out fairly quickly. So knowing where, based on what product you're solving for, where should that retention number stand is actually one of the most important things that you should think about. Setting yourself for either the lower end of the spectrum or the higher end of the spectrum is actually one of the big mistakes I commonly see a lot of startups make. Just because it's cool to say WhatsApp has 90%, weekly active users, suddenly every other new social app which considers itself as part of the core for the user base starts to think of that as a benchmark, but that's not really an apples to apples comparison. And so it's important to know what to compare against and what is the industry benchmark. And so based on the core action and frequency, so once you've sort of identified what the motivation is, what the core action is, and how frequently does your user make that core action, I think you need to then sort of look at dissecting your user base into 3 cohorts, right? There's going to be some users that are your core users, that are your power users, right? They come to your app every day. They know every aspect of your app. They are the most loyal customers you have. They're also your superheroes. They are the source of all the word of mouth you ever are going to have. Then there's this casual user who kind of understands the value proposition but isn't convinced fully. He's still kind of thinking about, every now and then I kind of use it because I like it, but I'm not in love with it. And then there's these dormant users that, because of either running some marketing campaigns or incentives that you provided, they showed up to your app, and they kind of used it once, but they don't necessarily fully understand what the app provides, and so they just kind of sign up, get the incentive, and they just never show up, right? So those are your dormant users. Ideal case scenario is you want to move everyone towards the core user behavior, right? So you want to have as many of your casual users become your core users, and as many of your dormant users become casual users and then into your core users, right? That's when you have over majority of your user base become core users. That's when you have a really, really sticky app. All the big apps that you know that do well and are successful, companies like WhatsApp, companies like Instagram, Airbnb, Uber, Dropbox, they all have surprisingly majority of their user base as their core users. If you ask them, where do you share your photos? They're going to tell you Instagram. How often do you open them? Once an hour. How do you think about travel? Like, I only travel on Airbnb. So the more you move your casual users into your core users, the higher your retention is, because they just understand your value proposition. They become loyal over time. They build the social networks. The barrier to exit is very, very high.